This morning, I want to share a parable, a story with you from the annals of my life about the war of the tax collector and the Pharisee inside of me. In my earliest memories, I am sitting in church in the balcony next to my father, and I am fascinated as the organ music plays by the way that the light glistens through the stained glass window of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, causing the dust in the air to glisten in muted tones. It doesn't surprise me at all that my earliest memory happens in church. As the youngest child of Church of the Brethren missionaries, the church and the teachings were at the core of our family's life together. Every morning began with family devotions because we needed to know the stories of the Bible in order to follow in the way of Jesus. When I was in grade school, my father had me memorize the Beatitudes with special emphasis on blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. When I was a child, Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy were all assassinated. The Vietnam War was raging, and the nightly news carried a daily casualty count. For my parents, it felt urgent that they teach their kids that all war, all killing, all violence is a sin. The summer before I started college, I went off to what in the Church of the Brethren is called National Youth Conference. And I joined 4,000 other youth as we sang together. And I specifically remember a kind of a Church of the Brethren ballad called Brave Man from Ohio. It's a song that pays tribute to Ted Studebaker, a Brethren man who, instead of being drafted in the Vietnam War, signed up with the Vietnam Christian Service. He did agricultural work in Vietnam and was executed by North Vietnamese forces. The song has a refrain. I won't sing it for you, but it goes like this. And it's based on the words that Ted Studebaker spoke to his church before he left. Give me a shovel instead of a gun, and I'll say so long for now. And if I die, I'll die making something instead of tearing something down. The conference was held in Estes Park, Colorado, which is pretty close to Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. So instead of going to the swimming pool with some of my friends, that one afternoon I joined other friends and chaperones, and we went out to the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons plant. We went to protest on the train tracks. These were the train tracks in which the weapons were moved out of the plant. And I felt so fierce as I stood there with my Give Peace a Chance sign on those railroad tracks, protesting the building of nuclear weapons, even though no trains were scheduled that day. We didn't block any trains. No one got arrested. But I was standing up for the simple truth that all killing, all war, all violence is sin. And I felt righteous. At that same conference, I attended a workshop about the death penalty. Sorry. And we were invited at the end of that workshop to take a bracelet that had on it the name of a death row inmate. And the idea behind it was that every time we looked down at our wrist, we would remember to pray for that death row inmate. I took a bracelet and I chose the name David Leslie Murdishaw. Now, I didn't know anything about David Leslie Murdishaw, other than, of course, he was on death row. I didn't know the crime for which he was committed, or how old he was, or where he was incarcerated. Google didn't exist back then, so I couldn't just easily learn more about him. But I want to admit, it didn't even cross my mind. didn't even cross my mind to wonder about David Leslie Murdashaw and how he ended up on death row. Because to me, it didn't matter at all. I knew the clear and simple truth that killing people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong is absurd and sinful. It all made so much sense to me. At 17 years of age, it all felt simple and true and obvious. That fall, I headed off to college, believing I was ready to have my mind and my life expanded. But the truth is, deep down, I felt ethically superior, as if I already knew the truth of all things in my vast life experience of 17 years. As my parents drove away and I got to know my roommate, on my wrist, I wore the name of David Leslie Murdashaw, a man I didn't know and didn't bother to get to know. I felt righteous just wearing his name every day. College tested my beliefs, the faith practices of my religious ancestors, and most importantly, my ethical superiority. And the largest challenge to what I knew to be true came when I started dating Brian, who became my husband. Brian was a couple years older than I. His parents weren't Church of the Brethren missionaries, and they weren't part of the same political party I was part of. In Brian's family, military service and Christianity went hand in hand. When I went with Brian to visit his conservative evangelical church, there was a sign above the door that said, "This church has absolutely no affiliation with the National Council of Churches." And at the time, my father was the Church of the Brethren representative to the National Council of Churches. Well, my favorite outfit was a pair of overalls that I just covered with peace buttons. Brian was taking boxing lessons. We differed on faith and social issues. He thought me very naive, and I thought he got faith and patriotism mixed up. But Brian was funny and bright, such a gentle soul. My family refers to him as the sage. I loved being with him. One night early in our relationship, we went out for a walk and we were walking along, we were holding hands and we were talking about school stuff when all of a sudden he changed the subject and he said, "I notice that every day you wear the same bracelet on your wrist, and I wonder what the story is behind that bracelet." I think he probably thought it had the name of a boyfriend back home. So I told him about National Youth Conference and the workshop I attended and on the evils of the death penalty. I held up my wrist as I explained that I had committed myself to praying for this death row inmate. And he stopped walking and he took my wrist and he read in tiny little letters the name of that death row inmate. And he went pale. "David Leslie Murdashaw?" He said. "Are you kidding me? David Leslie Murdashaw?" After a long time, he finally whispered, "David Leslie Murdashaw is the man who murdered my very good friend, Jim Henderson." I didn't know what to say. I didn't say anything. We just started walking in silence. We got to the city park. We found ourselves sitting on the swings. And Brian, fighting tears, began to tell me the story of his good friend, Jim. Before I started college, Brian had done an abroad program in Greece. And Brian and Jim Henderson, another student on that abroad program, became really good friends. They roomed together, and during all the school breaks, they traveled together to Jordan, Egypt, Israel. To the squeaky, methodical sound of the swings going back and forth, Brian recounted stories of all of their adventures together. Like the time Jim woke Brian up in the middle of the night in the hostel they were staying in and said, "Brian, this place is on fire." "Jim saved my life," he said. When they got back to college in the US, they had all these plans for future adventures, future travel they wanted to go on together. And then one day, Brian bumped into Jim as he was walking to the university library. And Jim said, "I'm going out to the desert this weekend with a group of friends. One of them has a final film project he needs to get done, and we're going to go help him. It's about a guy who's stranded in the desert. It's going to be a lot of fun. You should come along." And Brian, who was a huge procrastinator, said, this was right towards the end of the year, said, "I have a paper due that I haven't started, so I can't go." Procrastination saved Brian's life. On that fateful Sunday, while Brian was sitting in his dorm room working on his final paper for American history, Jim and his three friends met David Leslie Murdashaw in the Mojave Desert. The group was frantically trying to finish up all their filming while the light was still good. Murdashaw and his brother-in-law Greg had gone out to the Mojave Desert that weekend looking for a deserted place where they could shoot off 22 caliber rifles. They came equipped with 500 rounds of ammunition and lots of beer. They just happened to travel down the same dirt road where Jim and his friends were filming. They may never have met, except that Murdashaw's car stalled out on that sandy road. Murdashaw and Greg tried to get the car going again, but they were unsuccessful. So they started walking, hoping against hope that they would run into somebody who could help them. And that's when they saw Jim and his friends. Murdashaw approached the group and said, "Hey, our car's stalled out. Can you drive us into town?" And they said, "Sure, as soon as we're done shooting, because the light is just right now." So Murdashaw sat down and began to just drink beer after beer until he was really quite drunk. And then he whispered to his brother-in-law, "We should just kill these guys and steal their car." When Greg testified at Murdashaw's trial, he said, I thought he was kidding. So at 5 p.m., when the four of them started packing up the trunk of the car, that's when Murdashaw began to shoot. He shot two of them, and they hid behind the car. But he had a lot of ammunition. Jim said, "Two of us should just run in opposite directions because he can't possibly hit both of us at the same time. And if we don't go for help, we're going to die here in the desert." Jim and his friend ran in opposite directions, his friend Lance. And Lance is the only survivor of that group of four friends. When Murdashaw's brother saw what he'd done, he asked him why, and he just said, "I don't know." Murdashaw was sentenced to death and moved to San Quentin to await his execution. And a few months after that, I chose a bracelet with a stranger's name on it and promised to keep him in my prayers. When Brian finished telling me the story of his friend Jim, telling me about how Jim lost his life to the man whose name I now wore on my wrist, we just sat on those swings and said nothing for a very long time. Eventually, I took that bracelet off and I slipped it in my pocket. Brian reached out and took my hand, and we walked back to campus, different people. I learned a lot of things in college, most of which I don't remember at all. But the lesson is the bracelet is one that I have found that I just have to keep learning and relearning over and over again. Isn't it true that the most important lessons in our life just have to be learned over and over again? What the lesson of the bracelet taught me is that truth may be simple, but it's also complex and muddy, and that ethical superiority thwarts us from experiencing all the layers of truth. Conversation, authentic relationship changes us and it strengthens us. I still believe that killing people who kill people to show that killing people is wrong is absolutely absurd and sinful. I kept on praying for David Leslie Murdishaw, but I also prayed for Jim Henderson's family and friends. I now know that truth requires more of me than wearing a bracelet or some peace buttons on my bib overalls or holding a protest sign on a train track where no train is scheduled to come. And the man I fell in love with, the one who went to officer candidate school for the Marines, he sold his gun and he became a pastor in the Pacifist Church of the Brethren. Amen.